guards asked him to move, even though the ticket in his hand said row 1, not because he was loud, not because he was late, but because the color of his suit wasn't the problem. His skin was. And in that moment, Harvard didn't look as smart as it claimed. The ticket said Section A, row 1, but the way people looked at him, you'd think he'd wandered into the wrong story. Ezekiel Thompson adjusted the buttons on his marine dress blues and stepped out of the cab with the kind of presence that didn't need announcing. The morning was crisp, the sun sharp, and Harvard Law's graduation banners flapped above him as someone had finally noticed people like his granddaughter were changing the game. He stood on the sidewalk a moment longer than needed, looking at the building like it owed him something, and maybe, peacefully, it did. Today wasn't about him. It never had been. It was about Ava, his granddaughter, the same little girl who used to fall asleep with constitutional law books on her chest, who once got suspended in 7th grade for challenging her history teacher mid-lecture. She was walking across that stage today, Harvard Law honors cord around her neck, and she told him weeks ago, "Front row, Grandpa, I want to see your face first when they call my name." And just like always, he promised. And just like always, he showed up. He walked across Harvard Yard slowly, not because he was tired, but because this moment deserved to be felt, not rushed. He passed proud families in their Sunday best, students giggling in caps and gowns, and a photographer who offered to snap a quick picture, mistaking him for a guest speaker. He gave her a polite smile and kept moving. When he reached Section A, he paused. His name wasn't printed on the seat, but that chair belonged to him, not because of status, because of the story. He had sat through funerals, tribunals, and battles quieter than this, but this seat held something heavier than grief or command. It held legacy. He settled in, hands resting on his knees, hat in his lap, eyes locked on the stage that had taken generations to reach. The chair creaked under him, cheap plastic trying to carry the weight of a man who'd brought so much more. The crowd thickened. A mother nearby struggled with a floral bouquet twice her size. A father triple-checked his phone battery. Ushers hustled down aisles with nervous smiles. And just as the orchestra started to warm up, Ezekiel felt them before he saw them. 2 figures, one in a school blazer, the other in security uniform, approached with that polite urgency people reserve for situations they think might get uncomfortable. "Sir," the woman started, too gently. "There's been a last-minute adjustment to our seating. We'll need to move you to the West Terrace. It's shaded." Ezekiel didn't blink. "I'm not here for shade," he said, calm as steel. "I'm here to be seen." She looked down at the ticket in his hand. Cream-colored cardstock, an official seal, and bold black ink. Section A, row 1. "I understand, but the dean's office has reserved this row for university benefactors," she said. "And my granddaughter reserved it for her grandfather," Ezekiel replied. The security guard shifted beside her, clearly hoping this would end quickly. But it didn't, because Ezekiel didn't stand, and he didn't apologize for sitting. People around them had begun to quiet. Heads turned. The moment, once small, now stretched across the front section like a tension cord no one could unpluck. One of the ushers froze halfway down the aisle. A professor leaned out of his row to get a better look, and Ezekiel, he stayed seated like he had every right in the world to be there because he did. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't quote history. He just let his silence do what generations of men before him weren't allowed to do: take up space and not move. And that was the beginning of something neither of those school officials expected. Not resistance, not rebellion, but a reckoning. It was always the walk that gave them away, not the sound, but the stillness they left behind. Ezekiel Thompson didn't need to look up to know they were coming. He felt it in his spine, the way you feel a cold front before it touches your skin. He stayed seated, eyes on the stage, thumb pressed over the corner of his graduation ticket like it was a badge. He'd seen this kind of moment before, not in Harvard's front row, but in quiet offices, boarding lines, banks, restaurants, places where being present was somehow a problem. "Sir," a voice said, smooth as velvet, but trained. "I'm going to have to ask you to move." He didn't answer. "Not yet. We've had a change in seating." This row is now reserved for trustees and key donors. We've prepared another spot for you with excellent visibility, just on the west side. He looked up, just once. The kind of look that doesn't demand attention, but demands honesty. I've got a seat, he said, unfolding the printed pass Ava had sent him weeks ago. Section A, row 1, seat 3. My granddaughter gave it to me. Said she wanted to see me the moment they called her name. The woman, wrapped in a school-issued blazer and wearing a smile that hoped this would go quickly, took a breath. I understand, sir, but we have to make room for senior guests. Are they family? He asked. I beg your pardon, because that's what this section's for. Family. Not faces in brochures. Not checkbooks in blazers. Well, the security officer standing behind her shifted his weight, trying not to show how uncomfortable he looked. Probably hadn't expected to spend his morning asking a Marine veteran to vacate a chair at his own granddaughter's graduation. Still, he tried. Sir, we're just following protocol. Is that what we call it now? Ezekiel said. Protocol. His voice didn't rise. It didn't shake, but it settled into the ground like steel. She's the first in our bloodline to earn a law degree. And this seat, right here, was her gift to me. So, unless you're carrying a direct order from my granddaughter herself, I suggest you find someone else to move. The woman hesitated. We don't want to escalate. Neither do I, he said, finally turning his body to face them, calm as stone. But don't mistake quiet for compliant. Around him, the air thickened. Not loud, not yet, but people were listening. A man a few rows back lowered his phone. A woman near the aisle whispered something to her husband. The atmosphere changed not from volume, but from weight. Then came the fundamental shift. One man stood up older, with a wide frame, a salt and pepper beard, and a pressed navy shirt. He didn't speak, just stood. Then another. Slim, bald, arms crossed over a tan windbreaker. Then 3 more, scattered in different rows like shadows that suddenly had form. None of them wore uniforms, but their bodies told the truth. Shoulders square, eyes sharp. Stillness, like they trained for this moment without knowing they had. These were his brothers. Maybe not by blood, but by something more profound, by mud, fire, and years of silence endured together. Ezekiel didn't have to look at them. He already knew who they were. The woman in the blazer glanced around, now visibly rattled. The security guard looked smaller by the second. She leaned into her earpiece and muttered something, maybe for backup, maybe for an exit strategy. Whatever it was, it didn't matter anymore. Ezekiel turned back toward the stage, sit a little straighter, said nothing else, because the message had already been delivered. When Ava stepped out minutes later in her crimson gown, she scanned the crowd like a woman on a mission. And when her eyes found him, exactly where she'd placed him in her mind's map, she smiled. She didn't just see her grandfather. She saw the mountain she'd been climbing all her life, still, unmoved, unshaken, unmistakably there. You could miss it if you weren't paying attention. Just the way he Saturday still, hands resting on his thighs, not stiff but anchored, like a man who knew exactly how much space he took up and wasn't about to apologize for any of it. Ezekiel Thompson didn't flinch when they walked away. The woman in the university blazer with her polite discomfort. The security guard who didn't know where to look. They'd tried to move him, told him the seat was no longer his. That someone more critical had arrived, but he hadn't come for permission. He came because of a promise. And now he sat alone in the front row, ticket folded back into the inside pocket of his jacket, breath steady. The tension in the auditorium didn't break. It bent, like wood under weight. Quiet, creaking, waiting. He could hear the orchestra warming up behind the curtain. Students are shifting in line backstage. The murmur of families getting settled, unaware or pretending not to be of what had just happened. But the rows nearest him had noticed. People don't always speak when they witness something unjust. Sometimes they just lean forward. Sometimes they sit back. Sometimes they say nothing. But their silence takes on a new shape. And then something did change. A chair scraped against the floor. Just one, a few rows behind him. That subtle, familiar sound. A man stood up, not loudly, not to make a point, just stood. Ezekiel didn't turn around. He didn't need to. Another chair followed, farther left this time. Then a third, near the sound booth. There was no cue, no signal, just this quiet understanding like wind turning before a storm. 3 more men stood. Different builds, different faces, same posture, same history. It wasn't performance. There was no choreography. These were not men who needed to explain themselves. The man nearest the aisle crossed his arms over his chest and looked straight ahead. Another kept his hands in his pockets. One wore an old ball cap with a faded Marine Corps emblem. Another had a jacket with no insignia at all, but his stance said plenty. They didn't speak, but something in their silence rearranged the room. Ezekiel kept his gaze fixed on the stage, not because he didn't know what was happening behind him, but because he did. It had been years, hell, decades since he'd seen some of their faces, but he recognized them the way a man recognizes the sound of his name. He had led some of them and followed others, saved one, buried 2, shared moments they never talked about and probably never would. What they had was older than loyalty, deeper than memory. And in this moment, it became visible again, standing, silent, unshakable. The security officer who had tried to move him earlier was now posted near the side wall. He looked over, then away. The woman with the clipboard didn't come back. No one else stood. No one needed to, because the message had been sent, not with chance, not with confrontation, but with presence. The music began. Graduates entered from backstage, gowns flowing, faces split between joy and nerves. Families clapped, phones rose in the air. The energy in the room shifted, but that front row still held something heavier, something quiet, but not silent, still, but not invisible. Ezekiel's hands stayed folded, his back straight. He didn't speak, didn't smile. And then her name, Ava Thompson. The room erupted, but louder than the applause was something else. 6 pairs of hands clapping in perfect unison, not hurried, not performative, rhythmic, intentional, a different kind of sound, a sound that said, "We see her because we see him." She stepped onto the stage, and when her eyes found her grandfather in that front row, exactly where he said he'd be, exactly where she'd asked him to be, her breath caught. Because he hadn't just stayed, he had been held in place by history, and by the men who remembered it. They didn't tell him to leave, not at first. They asked, polite, composed, vague. The kind of ask that's designed to be easy to say yes to and difficult to justify saying no. But Ezekiel Thompson had lived through wars where the lines were never this blurry. He knew when a request wasn't a request. And this one, it reeked of something older, something quieter. "Sir," said the man with the earpiece and laminated badge, "we're asking if you'd be willing to move to the overflow section for visibility, for camera angles." Ezekiel didn't respond right away. He simply looked up, calm but unblinking. His skin was the color of deep mahogany, his eyes steel behind years of storm. That seat, front row, center aisle, was where Ava told him to be. Her exact words, "Grandpa, I want to see you when I look out." He wasn't going anywhere. The man shifted his weight. "I understand, but these seats were meant for—" "I have my ticket," Ezekiel said, voice like gravel and gravity. "It has my name. It has my seat. You can recheck it if you'd like." The man paused. For a second he hesitated, then turned toward another staff member and whispered. Within moments, a second figure arrived. This one is younger, uniformed, and trying too hard not to be threatening. But something in his stance betrayed his discomfort. The younger one stepped forward. "Sir, this is becoming disruptive. We're asking respectfully, please move to the back." A few heads turned now. Not many, but enough. Ezekiel remained still. "Disruption," he said slowly, "doesn't begin when people resist. It begins when people forget why they're asking." The younger guard blinked, unsure how to respond. The air changed. It was subtle at first. You could miss it if you weren't watching. The way a man 3 rows back sat up straighter. The way someone else crossed their arms, not in defiance, but in readiness. A rustle, a breath held too long. The kind of shift a room makes just before it remembers. It's not just a room, it's a witness. And then, like a ripple, 6 men stood, one at a time, in different corners of the auditorium, not dramatically, not for show, but the way old soldiers do, not together by design, but by instinct. They didn't speak, they didn't shout, they didn't need to. They simply made it known. This man was not alone. The guard stiffened, looked around, realized suddenly that Ezekiel wasn't the one being watched anymore. He was. Still, he didn't back down. Not yet. Not before saying something he couldn't take back. Just because you're in a suit doesn't mean you own the place. This is a university, not your base. The sentence hung there, and the moment it dropped, so did the temperature. Ezekiel stood. It was the kind of standing that felt ancient, as if history were rising from a chair. He didn't puff his chest, didn't raise his voice, but something in his stillness turned volcanic. I didn't come here to prove anything, he said quietly, but I've buried men more honorable than this room deserves. One of the veterans stepped forward. You should walk away, he said to the guard. Calm, even, final. The guard did, not because he was convinced, but because everyone in that room knew he was outclassed. At that exact moment, Ava's name was called. The timing wasn't planned, but it couldn't have been more perfect. She stepped onto the stage and locked eyes with her grandfather, who was right where she had asked him to be. Still, present, unmoved, surrounded by silent shadows who once bled beside him and still stood when it mattered. The applause was thunderous, but beneath it came something else, a shared understanding, the kind that slips under the skin. A recognition that respect isn't something you ask for, it's something you hold, without words, without compromise. And that day the lesson landed harder than the ceremony. He didn't ask to be honored. He didn't even expect a decent seat. But when Ezekiel Vaughn, a retired black Marine, quietly made his way to his granddaughter's college graduation, he was there for one reason only: to keep a promise. Ava Vaughn had worked for this moment her entire life. She was the first in her family to go to college. 4 years of night shifts and scholarship essays. And every late night, she'd whisper the same thing before bed. Make Grandpa proud. He had raised her since she was 9 years old. No pomp, no complaints. Just iron shirts, firm hands, and a heart so full it barely fit in his chest. The graduation was held in an open-air stadium. The sun baked the aluminum bleachers. Balloons bobbed. Proud families squinted at programs, searching for names. Ezekiel had shown up early. His dark blue blazer bore 2 service pins. His cane tapped lightly on the concrete as he walked. His ticket read, Reserved Family Seating, Row 1. When he reached the front, 2 security volunteers looked at him, then looked again. One leaned in, polite but firm. Sir, this section is for immediate family only. I'm her grandfather, he said. You can sit just behind the family row, sir. There's still a good view. Ezekiel didn't argue. He held up the printed pass. It says front row. They hesitated. One of them whispered into a radio. The other added, We're just following orders. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't plead. He simply said, I followed orders my whole life, but some seats you don't give up. It was the way he said it. Calm, steady, like he'd earned that space long before the chair had been placed. Still, the guards motioned for him to move. He remained seated. Rows behind him, 6 men noticed the exchange. No one clapped. No one pointed. They just stood quietly, one by one. Different skin colors, different ages. But all had one thing in common. They had served with him, bled with him, buried brothers beside him. No one had called them. No text, no signal. But they knew what that moment meant. Loyalty, like muscle memory, doesn't rust with time. The audience, at first oblivious, slowly caught on. Conversations hushed. Parents stopped mid-sentence. A girl dropped her phone. And just like that, the energy changed. From across the stage, Ava spotted it. She didn't need to hear words. She saw her grandfather surrounded, not by noise, not by confrontation, but by presence. The kind of presence that makes a statement without making a sound. The ceremony continued, but the rhythm had changed. The applause now had weight. Every name called was followed by claps that seemed different, as if everyone was aware they were witnessing something more than caps and gowns. When Ava's name rang through the speakers, Ava Vaughn, the 6 men clapped in perfect sync. Their hands struck like a cadence of honor. The crowd followed. Some stood, some cried. Most didn't know why exactly, but they knew it mattered. Ava walked slowly and regally onto the stage, her eyes locked on the front row. He didn't stand. He didn't wave. He just nodded. Once, after the ceremony, under the shade of an old oak tree, Ava found him. She collapsed into his arms. "They tried to move you," she said. He held her tighter. "And you walked across anyway. That's how I knew you'd already won." She pulled back to look him in the eye. "Why didn't you fight them?" "I did," he said, "by staying seated." "And those men, who were they?" "Brothers," he replied, "and reminders of who I am, of what I've stood for, of what still matters." A breeze passed between them. They never had to say a word. Ava whispered. "No," he said. "The truth rarely needs to shout." She wiped a tear and laughed. "You always know how to do that. Say the one thing that makes everything make sense." He smiled. "Because one day, you'll do the same." They walked back to the car together. No medals, no headlines. Just a man who had stayed still when the world asked him to shrink. Under the oak tree, the leaves stirred as if they too remembered. Some seats indeed are never meant to be surrendered, not because of status, not because of pride, but because of who you are. When no one is clapping, the world will tell you where to sit. But some seats are not for surrender. This wasn't just a story about a man at a graduation. It was a story about presence, about what it means to stay visible when the world politely suggests you disappear. Ezekiel didn't raise his voice. He didn't wear his medals like armor. He didn't need to, because some people carry their stories in silence and still speak louder than anyone in the room. He stayed in that seat, not to make a scene, but to keep a promise. And that might be the most radical thing you can do today. Keep showing up, quietly, fully, without asking for permission. That front row wasn't about status. It was about memory. It was about love. About a granddaughter who needed to see the face that raised her, that shaped her. About a generation that sat down so others could stand up. About men who stood again, not to fight, but to say, "We still see you." Maybe that's what we forget in all the noise. That dignity doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just stays seated. If this story reached you, if it reminded you of someone who stayed when it was hard, who held the line without applause, let them know. Share it. Speak their name. Or simply sit beside someone today and make them feel seen. We tell these stories not because they're rare, but because they're true. And too often, they go untold. So if this one stayed with you, we invite you, stick around, watch another, share it with someone who needs a reminder that they're not invisible. And if you'd like to walk this journey with us, subscribe, comment, be part of this space where dignity is honored, not asked for. Thanks for listening. And wherever you're sitting today, may you sit in your story with pride. Wishing you a beautiful day.